I have a rule when it comes to teaching, even in youth settings. I will not protect you from your Bibles. The Bible is a very, very old document. It is filled with sensibilities and ideas that we wouldn't necessarily agree with. And it doesn't actually ask you to agree with everything that it actually says. Not everything that it teaches is meant to be prescriptive and saying, now go and do likewise, right? Today we're going to cover a fairly graphic story. At least I think it's pretty. I'm going to interpret it in a way that draws a graphic conclusion, and I think it's the right way to actually read the story and why it's here. This will conclude Noah's subject matter. Next week we'll look at what's called the Table of Nations and why it actually appears in Genesis, and why genealogies and stuff like this are important to the Genesis narrative and the Bible in general. But today's story is just fair trigger warning. Not going to be the most polite conversation in society that you'll get even in the Bible. That being said, let me just kind of review where we've been at thus far in the book of Genesis as we're covering the basics of the Bible here. So God promised in Genesis 3:15, even while he's cursing the world, the serpent, but not humanity, in 3:15, he traces a promised seed to come that will defeat the serpent. And Genesis has been tracing from Adam and Eve the bloodline of the seed from Adam and Eve down through Seth, down to Noah. And we're on the back end of Noah's lineage here and the post-flood details. So Noah's bloodline is traced in Genesis 5, and at the end of Genesis 5, we came to Genesis 6 with the second rebellion. The celestial and terrestrial rebellion took place. The sons of God, high-ranking celestial beings who are council members or were council members in God's divine council, they left their established places of authority to hook up with human women. So they commit sexual sin. And what we're going to be talking about today is another sexual sin. Their sexual sins produced what was called the Nephilim, a giant race of humans. But we talked about the fact that in the ancient world, people grew to about 5 and 5.5 feet tall. So a giant is like a 6.5 foot tall person in their mind. It's not a mythical 20 foot tall creature, right? It is just a really, really tall person. The season 2 of Reacher is about to come out on Amazon Prime, so I'm rewatching season 1 right now, and it's awesome. But he's 6'5", and so everybody in the town of Margrave that he's in season 1 refers to him as a giant because he's a head taller than everybody else. And that's really the exact same language that's being used here. The term giant is merely ridiculously tall warrior race of people. So through the influence of the sons of God on the human race, humanity's corruption in Genesis 3 is exponentially sped up. Genesis 3 creates it. Genesis 6, the sons of God come down and they give this access in humanity to a bunch of forbidden knowledge, information, and things that humanity could have found out by themselves, but because the sons of God taught them, it just completely corrupts them to the point where their accelerated human depravity comes to the point where God looks out on humanity, the human race, in 6, 11, and 12, and he says things are so bad, the only thing left to do is to hit the cosmic reset button. And he's going to unleash the cosmic floodwaters that he held back in Genesis 1 to create the world. He's going to unleash that, uncreate the world, and then recreate it again as the waters recede. We've already looked at all of that. So the cosmic chaotic floodwaters of pre-creation are what's used to uncreate the land, everything on it, and to start over again with the only person who's found favor in God's eyes, Noah. Morning, Casey. Noah, and by extension, his entire family, right? 3 sons and all 4 of their wives. So 8 people have survived the flood, and we're going to deal with these 8 people here this morning. So the world is uncreated for a little over a year, but then at the end of that year, the creation is recreated out of cosmic floodwaters, just like it's created in the first creation story in Genesis 1. Noah and all the living creatures are called out of the ark, and they begin recreating the world across the entire land. So that's where we left off last week. But we also included that through Noah, God made a legally binding covenant with all of creation. A covenant is an ancient form of a legally binding contract. Whereas we go to court or we hire lawyers to draw up a contract and we sign the contract, ancient covenants are socially the form of making those ancient contracts. So God makes the first one in the Bible with all of humanity through Noah, and he's making it with all of humanity and all of creation for all of time. He will never again use the cosmic floodwaters to destroy the world. This new creation will continue unabated by universal calamity. That's the idea. And in order for this new creation to continue, humanity is going to have to take up some social responsibility for their pre-flood corruption by the institution of what? What is this new law that God puts in place? God institutes the death penalty in the Noahic covenant, right? He wants humanity to take responsibility for their own corruption, and he knows humanity is just never going to learn responsibility if they don't have full and complete responsibility to do this. So all of society is meant to judge the murderer and put the murderer to death. That brings us up to the text for today. If the story ended just right there at the end of 9:17, and we heard no more from Noah and his family, we might justifiably think that the new world is now perfect and uncorrupted. But in Genesis 9:18, all the way down through 29, the text records a sinful post-flood incident in which we see human corruption is still on full display, with verses 26 and 27 giving hope for humanity, that the world is not left only to be corrupted, but despite verses 28 through 29 reminding us of the effects that the curse of Genesis 3 is still ultimately on full display and full control over the creation, post-flood or not. Genesis 3 is still in effect. People sin, people face the result of that sin, they die in this world. So, one quick thing that you want to note is that generally the ancient Hebrews follow this style a lot in their writings. They give you positive, 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 positive. Hey, everything's going well. Everything's going well. Look at what God did. Look what God said he was going to do. Then look what God did. And then there's the result, and it looks really positive. And then they turn around and they give you the negative. They tend to group their stories not based on chronology or the order of events. They tend to base their stories and write their books like Genesis, Exodus, and stuff based on topics. They group things together topically. And so what you typically get in the Old Testament is you get all the good followed by all the bad. And the way that it's designed is to say, hey, a lot of good came out of this person's life. A lot of good came out of what God did through this person. But this wasn't the ultimate fulfillment of what God was promising to do. This is not the ultimate salvation. And you know that because that person committed this sin. That person was still corrupt in this way. Solomon was the greatest king Israel ever had. There was the most economic prosperity. There was the most peace. But then he screws it all up over his long reign, and God divides the kingdom. David is a great and wonderful king, and he did a lot to consolidate the 12 tribes into one kingdom. And a second Samuel will record all of that and all the good that he does. Then it will start recording. Then he slept with Uriah's wife Bathsheba, got her pregnant, and had Uriah put to death through the military stuff. And then it starts unraveling all the good that David does and all the fighting in his family that results from it. That's just how things are going. And here in Genesis, it's no different. It's giving you all the good that Noah has done up to this point. But Noah's family is still corrupt. And so this story is going to show the corruption so that you look at it and you see, oh, Noah was not the final comfort. Noah was not the final answer. And the Old Testament is going to keep doing this, and it's going to keep whittling down who is going to be responsible, who the seed is for bringing God's ultimate salvation, until you actually come to the end of the Old Testament and don't get an answer. You have to turn to the New Testament and start getting Christmas stories about God sending his own son into the world who never does anything wrong and is the ultimate answer to all the world's problems. So when you should read your Old Testament in the book order, in the books that were compiled there, and just know you're going to get a lot of the positive, and you're going to think, all right, things are good, the end. Nope. And then it's going to start unraveling things, and they didn't necessarily happen in that chronological order. That being said, let's read Genesis 9, 18 through 29, and then dive into what this is. So we're going to read it in the NIV, but the NIV obscures some of the language, so we're going to have to reference some other text in the New American Standard Bible. All right, so the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole land. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. While he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked backwards and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." He also said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem, and may God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be slave of Japheth." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. So the first thing to note here are the connections between the old and the new creation here. So when you're reading Genesis, as the story goes, you're supposed to see all these connections from what the setup was in Genesis 1 through 3. We've seen that the flood waters connection has already come and gone. So we start getting connections between Genesis 2 and 3 here with the end of Genesis 9. The way we've already seen Genesis 1 connecting with Genesis 6 through 8, and the connections are just kind of, here's like 7 of them right here. So God plants a garden, Noah plants a vineyard. A vineyard is kind of like a microcosm of a garden. Garden, probably you grow lots of things. A vineyard, you grow one thing. The grapes you're going to use to turn into wine, right? But the picture is the same. A vineyard was a common stand-in for saying garden. All throughout the Old Testament, you'll see that everywhere. So that's the first major thing. It's planting the idea in the reader's mind of saying, not only here is a new creation, which we've already covered, here's a new garden. What's going to happen in the garden? Well, humanity is going to be as sinful and as fallen as they are when they were kicked out of the garden. That's the picture that we're getting at. This is setting that up. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. Noah drank from the wine. So there's a connection here between saying fruit is going to be the problem. I'm telling you, you just need to stick with meat and potatoes. All right? That's what I do. I seem to avoid a lot of sin because of it. Just a piece of advice. All right. Their eyes were opened. Noah became drunk. So the results of eating the fruit are bad results. The idea of their eyes were open, we talked about, is an ironic statement in Genesis 3:7. Their eyes were open did not lead to good consequences. When their eyes are opened, they're ashamed of their nakedness. Noah becomes drunk and has uncovered his nakedness, all right? So they saw that they were naked, and now Ham saw his father's nakedness. So there's a connection here with nudity and shame coming up. They made themselves clothing. Shem and Japheth cover the nakedness of their father, whatever that means. God said, "Where are you?" Noah knew what his son had done. So God's statement, "Where are you?" is calling humanity, Adam and Eve, to account. Noah's knowing what his son had done, is calling his son to account, cursing one son or grandson, and then blessing the other two sons. God's promised seed of the woman and the blessings through the seed of Shem, which we'll hopefully have time to get through to today. So all of this is connecting the post-flood stories back to the same garden motifs that have already cropped up to point out that humanity is still as fallen as pre-flood humanity was when they were kicked out of the garden. These are just 7 that I could see and come up with, all right? There may be more. Verses 18 and 19 start with this introductory shift to a new portion of the story. This is Shem, Ham, and Japheth right here. And in the introductory thing, the statement, we're pivoting to a new story here. Creation is being reestablished. They're coming out of the ark. They're multiplying. But stop and pay attention to this. The 3 sons of Noah that came out of the ark and stuff are multiplying and yada, yada, yada. But the author goes out of his way in this introductory statement to mention that Canaan is that Ham is the father of Canaan. Why would he do that here? Why would he do it in verse 22 as well? He goes out of his way. He's going to mention Canaan 5 times by name in these few verses that we're covering today. He goes out of his way twice to actually mention that Ham was the father of Canaan. Keep that in mind because it determines how you're supposed to read the story. When an author goes out of his way to give you information up front, pay attention to that information. Here, the author is going out of his way to say, hey, Ham, the father of Canaan, you picking up what I'm laying down? Are you? And, maybe we are, maybe we're not. Let's find out. Noah was a man of the soil, so soil is the Hebrew word Adamah, which just as Adam was taken out of the Adamah, Noah is connected to the land again. This is language that's designed to actually picture Noah as a new Adam, which we talked about a little bit last week. Adam was meant to be a king priest in the garden of God. And Noah building the altar and sacrificing the clean animals and God being comforted by Noah, whose name means comfort, and establishing the covenant with creation and everything. Noah's living up to his comforting name, and he's pictured as a new Adam, both before this and during this. All right, which is exactly what I said here. And the man of the Adamah, the new Adam, proceeds to plant the vineyard. He plants a vineyard as God planted a garden, which we've already covered. But I just want you to note in this the passage of time. It takes time to clear land, plant seeds, those seeds to grow, and then those seeds to ferment, and out of the fermentation process make wine. So this is summarizing in the introduction that time is passing. The word proceed, Noah proceeded to plant a vineyard in the NIV. It could be translated as, and you may find a translation that says, was the first to plant a vineyard. And the reason I'm pointing this out to you is because some people suggest that if Noah was quite literally the first person to plant a vineyard, because it doesn't come up in Genesis 2 through 9. This is the first time that drinking and vineyarding is actually mentioned. So that if he was actually the first to plant a vineyard, some people would suggest that in making wine, Noah didn't know he would become drunk. And that this was not so much a deliberate action of his as it was a mistake. I think technically that could be true, but I think that is a very unlikely interpretation. The ancients were not stupid. They knew what wine was, and I do not think you need to press this language so literally as to mean Noah was the first person to plant a vineyard, but technically you could. So I'm throwing it out there. If you come across this interpretation, is usually by those who want to see Noah in such a positive light that they disregard his choices in this story. But I think to do that undermines what the story is all about. Without explicitly being told by the author that Noah didn't know what he was doing in planting a vineyard and making wine, we should interpret more responsibly by assuming that he did in fact know. So, but regardless of Noah's choices, it's Ham's choices that we need to pay attention to, because Ham is the one who will commit the crime in the text, while his two brothers are going to make an opposite choice. So here in verse 22, let's talk about Ham's sinful choice and his boast. Again, it says Ham, the father of Canaan. So for the second time, the author goes out of his way to mention Canaan in connection to the story, and we need to ask ourselves why. But the reason why is going to be based on the interpretation of what the NIV interprets as saw his father's nakedness. And I need you to know this is not the best translation. It's a bit misleading, because what the NIV is trying to do is translate in such a way as to smooth over this Hebraic idiom and a euphemism that is inherent in the text. So, what's an idiom? What's a euphemism? Hopefully by now in your education, you've actually covered these terms in an English class, and you should know. An idiom is just an expression of any kind. It's a turn of phrase. Even when we tell people, hey, open your eyes, we're using an idiom. Hey, pay attention, wake up, see something you're not used to seeing. We have all sorts of idioms in our language. Most languages do. We're not Drax the Destroyer. When in the first Guardians movie where Rocket's saying his people have no metaphors, they're strictly literal. Humans are not literal creatures. We do not speak literally to one another. We speak in idioms and expressions. We also speak in euphemisms. We substitute words or phrases in order to sound less blunt. So when you're talking about something that's pretty adult and graphic, a euphemism is a way of letting your audience know, hey, you're talking about something sexual without explicitly saying what that thing is. This Hebrew idiom about Noah's nakedness should read literally, Ham saw his father's nakedness. And this idiomatic euphemism is important because it's actually the exact opposite of the way it sounds in English. If you know the idiom. And in order to figure this out, let's look at a different translation in different texts. So the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, is a much more literal or wooden translation. They try to preserve the idioms and the expressions and the euphemisms that are inherent in the Hebrew language and just translate those exact expressions to English. The NIV is trying to interpret those and do away with the expressions. The problem is, I think the NIV, at least here, is coming to the wrong conclusion. Because if we look at Leviticus 18, 7 and 8, the text says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. That is, the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You are not to uncover her nakedness. So here, the language of her nakedness can refer to the mother, but also if your mother's nakedness is called your father's nakedness in Hebrew's idioms. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. So the phrase father's nakedness could actually be referring to the father, or it could actually be referring to your father's wife. Because their relationship in marriage, another form of covenant, by the way, in the Bible, is described this way in Hebraic terms. If there is a man who sleeps with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be put to death. They have brought their own deaths upon themselves. So another institution of capital punishment. Leviticus 20:11, right? Sleeping, but here there's no use of the phrase father's nakedness to describe the father. Here, sleeping with your mother is described as your uncovering your father's nakedness. So the Hebrew language understood and described sleeping with your father's wife as uncovering your father's nakedness. And the language of exposing someone's nakedness is not merely language for seeing someone naked, but of having sex with them. But it is euphemistic, idiomatic language. It is trying to be polite in a way, but it is also describing a harsh reality in Genesis 9. It is, therefore, justifiable to, in light of Leviticus 18 and 20 here, these specific verses, these passages use the Hebraic phrase of exposing your father's nakedness to describe sexual relations with your mother or stepmother. It is therefore justifiable to interpret the same phrase in Genesis 9:22 as Ham saw his father's nakedness as meaning Ham saw his mother's nakedness. See, it's actually the exact opposite. If you know how your Hebrews think. So a sexual sin is being referred to in polite euphemistic terms. That is, Ham sleeping with his mother, not his father. Does the phrase demand Ham slept with his mother? I mean, alone? No. After all, the text says he saw his mother's nakedness. Now, maybe he didn't mean to do that. And maybe his crime is boasting about it to his brothers on the outside, and he showed disrespect towards his parents. A lot of people interpret the story this way. They are mistaken because they're not taking everything the text has to say into account. If it just said he saw his mother's nakedness, or he saw his father's nakedness, meaning his mother's nakedness, we might be able to say, okay, there's not an actual sexual sin being discussed here. I mean, doesn't that just mean that he saw and didn't actually do anything? If that was all the text said, the answer would be yes, but we have already been given information multiple times that puts these sentences into the context the author wants us to see them in, which is what? Ham was the father of Canaan. Twice, it has explicitly told us who Canaan's father is. The point of the story then is this: in a moment of Noah's drunken wickedness, Ham sees the opportunity to try to exalt himself above his brothers by dominating his own mother and birthing a son through her in order to secure greater power and inheritance. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, how does this work? How is sleeping with Noah's wife, your own mother, going to help Ham be exalted over his brothers? And for this, we need to actually acknowledge two things about ancient Near Eastern culture that would have just been flat out assumed by the original readers. One, the rights of the firstborn inheritance. And two, sleeping with the previous patriarch's woman or women to establish oneself as the new man in charge. So, let's talk about the firstborn rights of inheritance here. Ancient Near Eastern patriarchal culture had a system of inheritance. Normally, the firstborn son of any family would receive a double portion of the father's inheritance for the purpose of becoming the next patriarch of the family. He would then lead and defend the whole extended family, including his own brothers and sisters. So the purpose of becoming the firstborn and receiving a double inheritance was about, you're going to be the new leader of the family clan. So let's talk about that a little bit. So a man with, say, 3 sons like Noah is going to split the inheritance 4 ways. He would give 1/4 of the inheritance to one son, 1/4 of the inheritance to another son, but he would give a whole half of the inheritance to his firstborn. Therefore, that firstborn son has the ability to use 1/4 of the inheritance to take care of his immediate family, and supposedly 1/4 of the inheritance to help the whole extended family. He was not supposed to squander it on himself and his own family and making himself richer. He was supposed to actually use that 1/4 of the inheritance, half of his own inheritance, to actually do right by his whole family. Verse 24 tells us that Ham was Noah's youngest son. We haven't talked about this yet, but 10:21 will tell us that Japheth was the oldest, so Shem is the middle child. Ham would have been last in line to get that double portion. Now, it was entirely possible that if your son screwed up or did something wrong, your firstborn son can lose his rights, and that would pass to the secondborn. And if that secondborn son screws up, that son can lose his rights, and it would go to the thirdborn. And he can become head of the family. That is possible, but it is deeply unlikely. Shem and Japheth would both have to screw up so badly that their father would take the youngest son and put him in charge of the family once his time ended as the patriarch. So Ham is going to be last in line. So if he wants to be greater in the pecking order, he's going to actually have to do something to put himself on top. So what do you do in the ancient world to put yourself on top? And let me just throw this out there. This is a picture of a story in Deuteronomy. I know it's also in Deuteronomy. I think it's also in the book of Numbers. Zelophehad was a man in the Old Testament who only had daughters. And so his daughters inherit his estate because he didn't have any sons. It was perfectly possible for daughters to receive a portion of the inheritance, but because of usually marrying and going to their husband's family, their inheritance typically came through their husbands. They would typically be taken care of by their sons and daughters in their old age as their children inherited, because unlike today where everything just stays in a bank account until you die, their resources were much more perishable, and you wanted your resources to stay in the hands of the most young and agile people, like your children, so that they could use it for the greatest amount of time and hopefully replicate and make more, and you would just live off your children's inheritance. So, but if you didn't have sons, it was perfectly possible in Jewish culture for women to inherit if they were unmarried. Even if they were, they could, but Zelophehad's daughters are all unmarried, so I'm just throwing that out there. And the patriarchy set up this thing in the ancient world, an ancient patriarchy. You sleep with the previous patriarch's woman or his women. So it was a common thing for ancient rulers, and especially kings, to keep harems, collections of women used for sex. That's a bit of an oversimplification. It's a bit of an over-caricature. There was more to it than just that. But if you were defeated in battle or you died, your harem went to the man who conquered you. So, sleeping with the women of the previous king was a sign of taking their power for yourself. Like an animal, you needed to mark your territory. How do you mark your territory? You walk into the kingdom, you walk into the king's palace, you find where his harem is kept, because usually they're kept in a separate part of the castle, palace place themselves, and you sleep with every one of them. And you say, ha ha, I dominate these women now. And everybody takes it as you dominate the kingdom. It was the easiest way of informing everyone that you're now the man in charge over the kingdom. And the Bible does not shy away from the fact that this happened in ancient Israel kingdoms. Biblical examples. When David was given the kingdom from Saul, his concubines, women who were not Saul's wife, but that he was allowed under ancient Near Eastern patriarchal culture to sleep with, he had to take care of them, he had to feed them, he had to shelter them and protect them. But David sleeps with Saul's concubines, according to Nathan in 2 Samuel 12. He takes Saul's concubines. In Genesis 35, Reuben, who's the firstborn son of Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, he sleeps with his father's concubine Bilhah because he's the firstborn, and he thinks, oh, this will be me taking charge, right? I'll go sleep with one of my father's concubines, and everybody will know I'm in charge now. Ironically, he loses his firstborn rights by doing this. Jacob's family is so dysfunctional that he has 12 sons and a daughter. His 11th son is Joseph. His 11th son will be the firstborn son, will receive the rights of the firstborn, because all of his brothers are so screwed up that they can't be trusted to lead. But ironically, the kingly line is going to come through the fourth son, Judah. And from him you get Jesus. Okay, other biblical examples. 2 Samuel 16. Absalom, son of David, rebels and usurps the kingdom from his father David. And when David is fleeing Jerusalem, once he's heard Absalom has led this coup d'etat against his own father, he says, we have to go now. Everybody pack up, run. And he's fleeing Jerusalem, but he leaves 10 of his concubines behind to actually take care of the palace. Concubines were allowed to have power in Israel, at least. That may not have been true in every culture, but he trusted his concubines. He leaves 10 of them distributed in charge of the palace. So what does Absalom do when he marches into Jerusalem? He takes his advisors and he says, all right, so what do I do to establish myself as the new king? And he says, his advisors say, take the 10 concubines your father left behind, pitch a tent in broad daylight in front of everybody, and go in one by one and sleep with them all. So that's what Absalom, son of David, does. It's not a good idea, but ultimately Absalom loses, dies, and the civil war ends, and David takes his throne back. He takes his throne back. He rules for the rest of his days. But Absalom has done this to send a message. I'm king, I'm greater than my father and stuff. The fighting in David's family continues on, and when we come to the end of 2 Samuel to 1 Kings, we find another one of David's sons, the next born in line, the next youngest after Absalom was Adonijah. He tries to acquire the kingdom for himself. While David is still alive, everyone knows that Solomon is supposed to be king, but because of God's word, everybody knows that. But David hasn't put Solomon on the throne officially yet. He's still alive, that's one thing. So, while his father is still alive, Adonijah, the oldest living son of David, tries to hold his own little secret coup d'etat. He gets the military, he gets the priesthood on his side, he gets all the political forces on his side at this secret thing, secret party, and declares himself king. And everybody there is like, yeah, we think Adonijah is going to be king. Woo, we're on your side. And so Solomon's mom, Bathsheba, and I think Nathan the prophet figure this out, and they go to David, and they hatch this plan to go talk to David and say, didn't you say Solomon was going to be king? Why is it that everybody's going to be proclaiming Adonijah king already? And so David tells his council, act fast, put Solomon on my donkey, parade him through the streets, and let everybody in Jerusalem declare him king, and then march him all the way into the palace and have him sit on the throne. During this time, David is dying. He is old, he is sick. David's weakness has always been women. This is his problem. Solomon's mother is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, whom he used in war to kill so that he could take her as his own wife. Nathan is the prophet that calls him on it. David's weakness has always been women. He will pass that along to Solomon, by the way. And what they have to do in proclaiming Solomon king in the midst of David's dying weakness is the first chapter of Kings records this. David couldn't keep warm anymore, even when he was under blankets. Knowing that women were his weakness, that women would make him happy, his counselors say, let's find a young virgin who's good looking and have her take care of him. Another euphemism. Hey, if we get old King David, probably in his 70s by now, a nice young hot pretty thing or something, he'll be in a much better mood. Let's do that. And they get him a woman named Abishag. But the text of 1 King is very clear. David didn't sleep with her. The text is like trying to tell us the story that David, whose primary weakness is women, despite all of his nobility, he has a weakness, women. He just couldn't do it anymore. He's so old and worn out, he could not sleep with this woman. But when Adonijah fails to actually collect the kingdom, he makes this request of Solomon. Solomon spares his life, by the way. And he says, your life will be spared so long as you have no threats against the kingdom and the throne. So Adonijah goes to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and says, do not deny me this request. Go into my brother's throne room, because you'll be welcome and I won't after my crimes, and request that David's last woman be given to me as my wife. Solomon rightly interprets this as Adonijah trying to usurp the authority of the throne for himself. Whether he sits on the throne or not, everybody is going to interpret it that way. Oh, the last king's last woman is now with this man. What does that tell us? That this man has inherited that last man's power. So, yeah, Solomon's going to be treated as a puppet on the throne, but Adonijah is going to be seen as the real king with the real authority if he gets this. Solomon calls it on him and he said, that's it, he's dead. I told him he could live as long as he didn't make any plays for the throne. This is making a play for the throne. Everybody knows it. So Solomon put his brother to death so there wouldn't be any more civil war. Because this is what you did in the ancient world to establish your power. Find the last leader's woman or women and sleep with them. So back to Noah. That's what Ham is doing here. He's trying to go from being the lowest in the pecking order to being the greatest. That's why he's boasting to his brothers about what he's done. Hey, Dad got drunk and passed out next to Mom. So I went in there and did exactly what men do to gain power to our own mother. And I'm coming out and I'm boasting to all of you about it. So who's the greatest now? Who's going to be first in charge now, right? That's what Ham is thinking. But when Noah wakes up and figures out what has actually happened, and by the way, we don't need to read verse 24, is this happening like the next day? It means more like after Noah had sobered up and, realized the circumstances of Canaan's birth, because this is a story about Canaan's birth. So we can't be sleeping with Noah, as some people interpret it, and there has to be asexual sin, but it has to be a sin with a woman leading to the birth of Canaan, because that's what this entire story is framed as. So as Noah is figuring out what has happened and time has passed again, which could be months after the fact, he says, cursed be Canaan. I said by. That should be. Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brother. So he doesn't curse Ham. He curses Ham's offspring, which is what the entire story is about. When you try to exalt yourself, you will be made the lowest in the pecking order. Cursed, drawing us back to Genesis 3 language. This language is meant to mirror Genesis 3 in a post-flood world. Sin, corruption, connection to the serpent. The fight between the serpent and the seed is still ongoing. The flood and recreation did not solve that particular problem. And we're not meant to read the story as if all is happy-go-lucky and the world was set right by the flood. There is still corruption inside of Noah that leads to his drunkenness. There is still corruption inside of Ham that seizes on the weakness of his father and tries to exalt himself by violating his own mother. What do you get? You get deviled Ham. Literally, this language connects Ham, via Canaan, to the celestial serpent's side. He's willing to rebel. He's willing to do what God says is out of bounds in order to exalt himself, just like the serpent in Genesis 3. He's willing to do just like the sons of God taught and do sexual corruption, if that means he's going to exalt himself. So both rebellions are being continued here in the post-flood world. The flooding and the recreation of the world was not the final solution to this ongoing fight. Noah did not bring comfort to the world in that particular way. We should be expecting someone else to come in the future. The question is, if not through Ham, through whom? Shem or Japheth? Because these are now our only two options. Because Noah only has 3 sons, and the youngest third one has disqualified himself. So Shem or Japheth. Both preserve the honor of their parents, and I would say both parents in verse 23, but only one can receive the firstborn authority that Ham was so clearly after. Verse 26, Shem is given dominion over Ham. Verse 27, Japheth is given dominion over Ham, but he's also said to live in the tents of Shem. This suggests that Shem will also somehow be over Japheth in some way. So this is only hinting what will later become explicit in Genesis. The seed bloodline is going to be passed on through Shem down to Abraham. So next week we're going to get the Table of Nations, where all 3 of these sons, descendants, and clans will move to, what people groups they become. Spoilers, Canaan becomes the primary place where God is going to pitch his own tents and fight against evil. Canaan is being set up here as a villain in the ongoing stories. Most of Ham's descendants will be. Egypt will be a descendant of Ham. Guess where they come up? Babylon, Assyria, all descendants of Ham. The villains of the rest of the biblical stories are being set up here because one father in one patriarchy decided he was going to take power for himself. Just like one little celestial serpent in one garden decided he was going to lead a rebellion, and we decided we were going to be on his side. One final note on Noah. Verse 28, the precise language of Genesis 5 is used again in this ending. The genealogy there is repeated here in the end of Noah's story. So it's connecting chapter 5 through 9 together as a single unit, but it also reminds us of the same pre-flood realities. Humanity is cut off from the tree of life in the garden of God, which means even righteous men like Noah will eventually die. So sin is still in the world, it still has its consequences, and it still climaxes in death. So we ought to be continuing to look for the promised seed of Genesis 3:15 in the new firstborn line of Seth. And out of that, you could trace the entire Old Testament story right down to the New Testament's birth of Jesus, which is what Christmas is kind of all about.